The impact of the Great War on the Christian religion is a fairly broad title. So as you'll see as I go on, I've focused it down just a little bit. But I want to focus on a few key examples. And just by way of background, just to think about the years leading up to the First World War. And I guess that was a period that's marked by an increasing awareness of the global dimension of Christianity. Ease of communication, as well as the astonishing success of missions, particularly in Africa, had led to all sorts of cooperative initiatives between the European nations, both in the mission field and also within Europe itself. The great gathering of missionaries that I've got here on the slide in Edinburgh in 1910 had achieved a sense for the Protestant churches that they were united around a common cause and should do whatever possible to cooperate in the cause of evangelization in the world. They rather ignored Catholics at that stage, but anyway. There were many so-called comity arrangements where colonies were divided up into different spheres of influence. Now, in the light of the conference, there was increased discussion between the historical churches and also lots of successful theological cooperation. There was a journal, for instance, called the Constructive Quarterly, which was the really pioneering ecumenical journal of the time. Certainly international cooperation was very close in the years leading up to 1914, and Germany provided a great deal of the leadership, especially in theology. Indeed, German Protestant theology had achieved, at least on the surface, an unprecedented academic reputation, both at home and abroad. And it was highly influential on the growth of theology in this city and more broadly in Britain. Many theologians, especially German ones, had a huge international reputation. Before the war, there was a great deal of common cause behind the advance of Christian civilization, as they understood it, and many leading religious figures who were involved in organizations for promoting friendship between the churches and the people that those churches represented. Now, the most important Protestant theologian and the most powerful figure in German intellectual life in the years leading up to the First World War was Adolf von Harnack. He got his von in 1914 for services to the state. And he gave, in 1911, he gave a keynote address to the first meeting of the Associated Councils of the Churches of the British and German Empires for the fostering of friendly relations between the two peoples, snappily titled. The great historical and cultural affinities between Germany and Britain meant that there was a great deal of common cause on religious, theological, and missionary matters. And the period really marks the beginning of the ecumenical movement that emphasized the unity of the churches across the world and had begun to see the Christian religion as something that was universal and could be understood and in the singular, something that was uniform and could spread right across the world. After long years of division, Christian religion was something that could be seen in the singular, and that's important because at the outbreak of war, everything was to change. I've shown here Harnack on the right of the picture and the emperor on the left. That was the intimate connection between the German state and Protestant theology and religion at the time. But as I say, everything began to change very quickly at the outbreak of war. So all that pre-war internationalism was completely transformed almost immediately, despite efforts of some German theologians to retain links for the sake of Christian mission. And all that meant, as was the case in lots of other areas of human culture as well, that the First World War was to make a huge impact on the Christian religion. Internationalism gave way to a resurgent nationalism that was often linked with the crusading zeal of the past. Different Christian nations were fighting crusades against one another. So the old national Christianities enjoyed immediate revival and were often pitted against one another. So not surprisingly, there were lots of interpretations early on in the war as the last crusade or as a holy war, and that's been given the title from some more recent books as well. And undoubtedly some of the political rhetoric used on all sides adopted Christian language almost immediately. The churches, many of which remained state churches, were enlisted in support of the competing war aims. Guns were blessed by prominent clergy from Moscow to London, and the deaths of soldiers were interpreted using Christian language, the Christian language of martyrdom, a good example on the slide. Arthur Winnington Ingram, for instance, who was Bishop of London and chaplain to the London Rifle Brigade, said to bereaved families in the very first year of the war, he said, "You've lost your boys, but what are they? Martyrs. Martyrs as really as St. Stephen was a martyr. Martyrs dying for their faith as really as St. Stephen, the first martyr, died for his. They looked up when they died in the trenches or in the little cottage where they were carried. They looked up and they saw Jesus standing on the right hand of God, and he is keeping them safe for you there when the time comes. Covered with imperishable glory, they passed a deathless life." In Germany, at much the same time, people were engaged in very similar kind of rhetoric. And Harnack was commissioned to produce a manifesto in support of Germany's war aims that was published in October 1914. The so-called appeal to the civilized world, or culture world as it is in Germany, carried the signatures of 93 intellectuals, and among the signatories were 7 Catholic and 5 Protestant theologians from different theological camps. These might be well-known examples, but there's many others that can be drawn from right across the belligerent nations, from Russia, Serbia, Austria, and even anti-clerical France. All of them displayed a similar alliance of church and nation. And what all that demonstrates, I think, is that trying to understand the Christian religion in the singular after the outbreak of war is fraught with difficulties. And the reason, again, is very simple. Despite the wholesale changes to European religious life during the period of Napoleonic domination, Europe was a very long way from being secularized. A Christian cultural framework pervaded the social and political life of the whole continent. The churches, whether they were established or not, were always working in a symbiotic relationship with the state. There were consequently as many different varieties of Christianities as there were varieties of nations and states. So the Christian religion wasn't a monolith. Even the Catholic religion wasn't a monolith, but was instead a collection of different expressions which related to the wider social and political culture. Religion wasn't yet a matter for private choice or personal decision, but was still usually an aspect of a broader cultural and national identity. So in many parts of Europe, one or other version of the Christian religion remained established and was simply part of that social fabric. So it's hardly surprising that the First World War was often interpreted in theological terms, since the Christian religion was all-pervasive and so often just simply a key aspect of a wider national ideology. So across Europe, and particularly in Germany, there were alternatives to religion in promoting a national ideology in the years before the First World War. So the Social Democratic Party in 1912 became the largest party in the German Reichstag. And yet that kind of development merely strengthened the resolve of many religious leaders to involve themselves in politics and public life. So there were church organizations, most importantly the Evangelical Social Congress, that was involved with social policy, and they were set up in direct competition to the Social Democrats, and they sought to introduce a greater sense of social integration within the state and society. So even if Christianity was sometimes struggling to keep pace, it was nevertheless, or at least it regarded itself, as at the very heart of society. And of course, there were many who welcomed the war as what has been called an antidote to anomie. The war provided that social integration that was beginning to be lost in the years leading up to the outbreak in 1914. So the war was greeted as a great step forward in social integration against the problems of the fragmentation of industrial society. So Harnack recognized in 1914, in place of industrial life, there is something ideal, such as one's country's life, or a great good to be won for all of humankind. This high-spirited disposition, ready to embrace life and death equally, is very closely akin to religion. People who'd neglected their inner life are now gaining a new relation to their brothers and an awareness of the transcendent meaning of their lives. But that wasn't just true of Germany, it was also true in this country. So Randall Davidson, Archbishop of Canterbury, noticed something extremely close to what Harnack had said. And here's a picture of the crowds gathering at the outbreak of war in Trafalgar Square. Davidson said this: "Ours is indeed a great and living hope for our own and other lands. Before the war began, we in England were in peril of great sunderings into sectional life and possibly even sectional strife. The war, which perforce cut rudely across our ordinary life and suspended countless things for good and ill, has obliterated many a barrier and sundering line, and men who had little in common have learned to know and understand one another as never before. Is that experience to be barren of fruit?" So the war was almost conceived in religious terms as the solution to all the problems of the Edwardian period. Now, why such an attitude was shared across the belligerent nations, it manifested itself very differently in different places. And that meant that that kind of ecumenical internationalism very quickly disappeared from Christian discourse. So the impact of the Great War on the Christian religion has to be understood as a series of particular impacts in specific societies. It's very different in one place from another. So what I want to do now is to focus on a couple of examples, they're fairly obvious examples, but I want to try and draw out some of the important strands. I want to start off with Great Britain. What I want to do is to look at Britain and how historical orthodoxy can be challenged if you look at what was going on more closely. So in Britain, for many years, the historical orthodoxy among those trying to understand the First World War and the role of religion was very much shaped by the kind of thing I was brought up with when I was doing my O-levels. An O-level generation, my O-level generation, was nurtured on the poetry of Wilfred Owen, and it probably still is, and Robert Graves's Goodbye to All That. And for that kind of understanding, the First World War provided or provoked a radical rupture in British society and a questioning of the religious verities that had underpinned the previous generation. That is something that I think we need to challenge. And another common assumption is that somewhat less challenging, I guess, than Wilfred Owen and Oh, What a Lovely War and all that sort of thing. But a second assumption is a common critique that came from within the churches and might be regarded as the failure of mission. So many religious writers during and after the war emphasized the experience of wartime chaplains as they uncovered a general ignorance about the Christian religion and its rituals. In addition, the mass slaughter in the trenches and the experience of untimely death were understood as leading to demands for the inclusion of prayers for the dead as a pastoral response to the absence of such provision in the existing liturgies of the Book of Common Prayer. So all of this, it was understood, led to a desire to change the Church of England's sacred Book of Common Prayer. And another, and not unconnected, interpretation of the impact of war was a growing perception of the inadequacy of traditional theology. So some chaplains, most prominently Geoffrey Studdock Kennedy, Woodbine Willie, were understood as popular theologians who questioned the tenets of Christian orthodoxy, especially on the participation of the Christian God in human suffering. God, it seemed, had to be present in the suffering and all the suffering of all those meaningless deaths. Otherwise, he wouldn't be present with the world at all. And finally, I guess we might more generally try and understand the Oh, What a Lovely War approach. That's Oh, What a Lovely War at the bottom there. The Oh, What a Lovely War approach to historiography, which sees religion as little more than an apologist, really, or the Christian faith, the Church of England, as an apologist for the military aims of the state. Now, I think if you take a closer look at all those common interpretations of the effects of the First World War on English religion, you can find something really very different. So to address the first point about the widespread questioning of religious belief, the figures reveal that there was no easily detectable change in religious practice in Britain at all during and after the First World War. And it's also extremely difficult to find much questioning of Christian belief, except in that very small elite, which had already been asking those kinds of questions well before the war. Virginia Woolf, for instance, said it was in 1910, not 1914, that British society famously began to change and people questioned all those old verities. For most people, however, there doesn't seem to have been much change in religious belief or practice. A very good example of continuity in religious practice comes from this very Diocese of Oxford, which rather accidentally had visitations, clergy inspections in 1914 and 1918. So a very good time to illustrate the differences between the beginning of the war and the end of the war. And Oxford Diocese as well is very representative of the whole spectrum of the Church of England. It's rural, it's urban, it's suburban, and it has that whole range of different churchmanships. Clergy were asked about what they saw as the main challenges facing the church and their ministry. And the only impact that the war seems to have had on those clergy responses is that there were fewer men in church. There weren't any answers at all that had anything to do with questioning the role of the church or the role of religion or religious belief more generally. It seemed as if things were carrying on much as they always had done before. Another bit of debunking is about the prayer book and the reform to the prayer book. Recent research has shown that actually the prayer book and the reforms to the prayer book that were defeated in Parliament in 1928, but the reforms to the prayer book had really very little to do with the First World War at all. Work was well underway before 1914, and it continued during the war, apparently independently from what was going on in the trenches. It was the partisan squabbles between the church parties before the war, rather than the war, that led Archbishop Davidson to initiate the quest for a broader range of possibilities in the prayer book, including such divisive issues as prayers for the dead. Similarly, the general frustration with the speed of the legislative process in the church was felt long before the war. So the life and liberty movement under William Temple, which eventually led to the creation of the Church Assembly in 1919 and parochial church councils, all of that seems to have had very little to do with the war at all. Now, third point is that the war also seems to have had a very limited effect on British theology. There weren't really any questionings of the basic orthodoxy of the past. So if the First World War had an effect on theology in Britain, it's chiefly that it focused attention after the war on the need for social reconstruction and on the development of social theology. So it's focused on things like the Christian Conference on Politics, Economics and Citizenship that was held in Birmingham in 1924. In all the other areas of theology, the same sorts of conflicts that had been there before 1915 continued unabated after 1918. So, for instance, discussions about the virgin birth and the resurrection. Again, it was as if very little had changed, except one important aspect, and that's about the impact of German theology. That had almost disappeared, and it allowed for a far less Germanophile style of theology represented by Anglo-Catholicism to grow in importance and really to become the most important aspect of theology in the 1920s. And another interesting and relatively unknown example is that of Hastings Rashtal, who at the time was a canon at Hereford Cathedral, and he preached the Bampton Lectures on the Christian idea of the atonement in Oxford in 1915. And there used to be the set text for those of us who struggled with the atonement paper in the old days. And what's interesting is that despite the subject matter of Christ's sacrifice, despite that subject matter, there isn't a single explicit reference to the war at all in the work of the leading liberal theologian of the time. But there is an emphasis on what was called the moral theory of atonement. So Jesus was interpreted in terms of John 15, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Now, while this might be a helpful way of interpreting the atonement for a congregation which was beginning to face unprecedented loss, there's little sense in which there was a questioning of the traditional doctrines of atonement at all in the face of war. And something can be seen at the end of the war in the very many different memorials that were produced. The churches always remained central in providing focal points for communities, and many drew on traditional religious imagery to try and explain what had been happening. In fact, many churches in the Church of England acquired crucifixes, which had hitherto been party badges of Anglo-Catholicism, but through the First World War they were transformed into reminders of the sacrifice of the innocent victims of war. So there's a subtle but not direct influence of the war on the movement of theology there. Now, the final point I want to look at in a bit more detail, and that's about preaching as a kind of form of state apologetics. That, I think, is something that needs to be challenged by looking at the evidence. I'm a sad person in having read through a vast number of published sermons in the church newspapers through the First World War, and it's almost impossible to find any direct jingoism preached from the pulpits. And that's also true in Germany at the same time. Almost every sermon that found its way into the national press retained a sense of perspective and a strong view of the importance of the common humanity, even of the enemy. And that can be illustrated using the example of Randall Davidson himself. Davidson always retained a critical distance and was careful not to dehumanize the enemy. There were always good Prussians alongside good Germans alongside Prussian militarists. Although, like most church leaders before and since, he always recognized the compromises of the situation which led to war, as well as the overwhelming strength of the political forces which limited the field of maneuver in which the churches could act. Nevertheless, he always retained a higher and universal understanding of humanity. The melancholy fact, he remarked in a sermon preached at the beginning of the war, the bewildering fact, the disastrous pity of it, is that the government of no one nation acting for its people's safety and happiness can disregard, as things now stand, what is said and planned and done elsewhere. It's a good reminder for Brexit, I suppose, but anyway. The church, he felt, was forced to recognise and work within the political strengths which necessarily limited the apparent purity of the ethical injunctions of the gospel. So Davidson made this need for some kind of compromise clear in a sermon preached later on in the war, where he drew from one of his favourite texts, redeeming the time because the days are evil. The peace of God, he held, was corrupted and distorted by the inherent wickedness of the situation. And verily for us too, in this year of grace 1916, he went on, the days are evil. So according to Davidson, the first duty of Christians was to understand the situation in order to learn of the possibilities for peace that were latent even in the most wretched circumstances. Real peace, he thought, couldn't be achieved by idealism or by a so-called pacifism engendered by the mere hatred of strife. Instead, within the real situations in which people found themselves, however desperate those might be, there had to be a responsibility to discern those inklings of good in the midst of grotesque evil, and that even included the enemy. In turn, that required a discovery of how things which should have been for our will had become the occasion of failing. So alongside all prayer and witness was another Christian duty, and that was the duty to think, to build structures whereby the hope beyond hope could continue to exist even within the horrors of war. Now, this was naturally going to be a complex task and would be fraught with problems. The difficulty, he said, of planning and fashioning new things will be far greater than we realise, and our power of doing it, and do it we must, will depend upon whether, in the midst of war and its dread concomitants, we have given our mind, yes, mind as well as heart, to these new and brave resolves. So what Davidson does is to call for a new vision of Christian hope which might take shape while the guns were still thundering and bombs and submarines were doing their deadly work, but which nevertheless took account of those circumstances. So Davidson preached no mere jingoism, but a far more considered and realistic response to the tragedy of politics. The Christian nations of Europe were at war. That was the given situation, and that limited the field of manoeuvre. So the march of destruction couldn't be halted by idealistic witness or constant prayer unless at the same time the realities of the situation were taken into account, and one often therefore had to compromise with evil as a necessary first step to the realization of the kingdom of God on earth. The responsibility of taking part in a war, he said, must always be a fearful one, an action only to be taken when it is called for by our fealty to him who ruleth over all, called for in obedience to a law far higher than any national decree, the following of immutable principles of right and wrong. In short, all loyalty to the nation was tempered against complacency by the desire for justice and righteousness, by hope and resolve for the future, in obedience to a higher law. So Davidson recognized that political realism accompanied any Christian idealism. So the gospel ideal, if it's to gain some kind of foothold in real time, had to work through the powers that be, while not condescending to their arbitrary authority. One always had to think critically alongside those powers that be. At the same time, the gospel had also to be used in such a way that such powers could be transformed in a Christian direction. So the misuse of power in the direction of pure aggrandizement of the nation could never be made compatible with the gospel. Yet loyalty to the nation, when given moral direction and constant reference to the higher loyalty to the King of Kings, could be a means to the better good, to the slow, painful realization of the kingdom of God. So for Davidson, the church worked not against, but with and through the broader political powers that structured society. It had always had a duty to act as a constant reminder to the nation of the higher duties of righteousness and justice. Only if it maintained a contact in this way would its authoritative voice be heard and wouldn't be relegated to some kind of sectary or idealist's talking shop. And another point that he made was that there was a need for the constant reminder of higher ends to play a role in the critical approach to social structures. Patriotism was continually brought before the bar of the gospel and subject to scrutiny and check. So there becomes a kind of overriding duty of the church for the future. And that forced Davidson to recognize the constraining forces of international politics. Yet at the same time, there's always that air of optimism and of idealism that forces a rethinking of the principles undergirding the nation. And those are the things that can lead to disorder and war, but can also be reconstructed into the future. So as he's looking towards reconstruction, towards the end of the war, he sees the church's responsibility to foster ethical institutions to underpin national structures, which in turn might then increase the power of the gospel within the very institutions of society. So he says, thinkers with vision did not restrict themselves to the patriotic demands of the day, but to a future in which Germany and Britain would once again be sharing the same world as partners in the fellowship of nations. So however bad the situation, there was always a sense of hope for the future, which was demonstrated in his efforts at post-war reconstruction. So just to draw a few strands together from this brief discussion of Britain, what I hope I've shown is that different aspects of British religion reveal, first of all, that there's some of the commonplace assumptions have to be brought into question. So despite the massive social disruption and huge loss of life, what's perhaps most surprising is that there was remarkably little direct impact of the war on British religion. But the other thing to remember is that Britain is obviously a victorious power, and that fact meant that the cause for which the British were fighting was almost universally recognised as just, even after the end of the war. And all of that served to confirm the identity and vocation of the British churches, especially the established Church of England, with its strong embeddedness in the structures of the state. There wasn't a social rupture in 1918, which meant that the churches carried on very much as they had done before, and religion carried on regardless. So let's just make a few comparisons with what's going on elsewhere. And I want to focus on Germany as the obvious other foe in the war, the obvious other belligerent party. The collapse of the short-lived German Empire at the end of the war led to a wholesale questioning of the relationship of the Christian religion to the state. Now, given the long-standing embeddedness of German Protestantism within the state, that meant a fundamental questioning of the whole nature of Christian religion altogether. Many historians of religion and theology have seen 1918 as a kind of caesura in German religious history, where everything had to be reconstructed from the bottom up. And all of that pointed back to 1914 and the support by the theologians and religious leaders of Germany's war aims. So that manifesto with which I started at the beginning, where Harnack drafts a manifesto supported by 93 intellectuals, was seen by some historians of theology as really the starting point for where everything went wrong. So Heinz Sant put it in his History of German Theology from 1914 onwards. Historically, he said, the 20th century began in August 1914 with the outbreak of the First World War. And the great Swiss theologian Karl Barth, I've got all three of them here. There's Gogarten on the left, there's Tönniesen in the middle, and there's Karl Barth on the right-hand side, the three radicals, or three key radicals who challenged the old order. So the great Swiss theologian Karl Barth also regarded the opening months of the war as a sign of the false direction that was being taken by the Christian religion in Germany. The publication of the manifesto, which had been signed by Harnack, as well as his teacher Wilhelm Hermann, was, he said, a black day for theology. Later on, he claimed that from that time onwards, he could no longer follow either their ethics or dogmatics or their understanding of the Bible and of history. For me, he said, 19th century theology no longer held any future. It was all over. Now, with more than a hint of rhetorical flourish, Barth was indicating that everything had to start again. The old union of religion and culture, which had been exemplified by the culture Protestantism of the pre-war years, exemplified by Harnack, all of that was revealed in its true colours. Theology, along with the religion it was seeking to discuss, was forced into an absolute dialectic. Either it was to succumb to the wider culture with all the catastrophic effects that had had over the past 4 years, or it had to begin again. So where the earlier theologians had sought to reconcile Christian truth with the march of human history, this interpretation of the impact of 1914 and 1918 sought the very opposite. The old model meant that religion had ultimately come to be the servant of the idolatrous forces at work in the state. So Barth and his colleagues consciously placed themselves in the avant-garde, and they drew on the kind of apocalyptic mood of the time. And the most avant-garde of all of them was Friedrich Gogarten, and he was to give his 1920 manifesto of this kind of model of theology, of discarding all that went before. He called it Zwischen den Zeiten, between the times, and it presented a direct challenge to those, including his teacher Ernst Troeltsch, who sought to integrate religion with the wider society. And in 1920, a radical journal was to take on that same title, Between the Times, as if somehow the old dispensation and all that it had stood for, the old understanding of the Christian religion, had all come to an end. So the Christian religion was constantly drawn into that revolutionary turmoil that followed the First World War. And one can understand this reaction as very much part of that broader revolutionary movement. So let me just look at Friedrich Gogarten in a little bit more detail. That revolutionary strand of Christianity shared a great deal with other movements that developed in response to the war. And Gogarten himself, along with the other contributors to the journal, undertook that theological revolt against history. And simultaneously, they attacked many of the assumptions of bourgeois society and liberal science, all of which they felt were guilty by association with their support for a state that had collapsed into war. these so-called dialectical theologians, it's either this way or that way, shared a worldview with some of the revolutionary thinkers that were published in the press that they actually published in themselves, the Eugen Diedrichs press, which had republished a new critical edition in German of Kierkegaard, translations of Tolstoy and Bergson, as well as several of Gogarten's own works. There is this kind of radical movement of which the Christian religion represented in this way was simply a part. And for them, the question was really simple. How was Christianity to be asserted in the face of the profound crisis provoked by the emergence of modern thought? Gogarten's perception of that crisis had been shaped by a reading of Luther and Kierkegaard and various signs, he said, of the modern spirit. So rather than searching for solutions in the past, Gogarten held out that there was a need to look beyond the old world, beyond the past, into another world altogether, to kind of escape history completely. The old world was exemplified by theologians like Troeltsch and Harnack, and that seemed to be at an end. So addressing those teachers of his, Gogarten wrote, "We were so far from this period that we had to look outside it. Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, Meister Eckhart and Lao Tzu have been our teachers more than you, to whom we are indebted for all our intellectual training." Everything seemed to be disintegrating, and all that was left for the Christian was to stand immediately before God. So the world and its history were no longer seen to be the bearers of meaning, but instead had to be revealed in their true colours. There was consequently what Gogarten called the crisis of our culture. And there's a strong influence of that great 19th century critic of Christendom, Kierkegaard, whose reputation was growing increasingly strong in the early 1920s. What was important was not the past or history, but rather to be really living in the present moment. Referring to the contents of the moment, he said, whatever they may be, to the absolute. So Gogarten continues, "The religious point of view has meaning only insofar as everything retains nothing but God, only insofar as everything human disappears from it, only when it crosses the border into a realm different in its very roots, and only when man's busyness ceases and God's activities begin." So the remedy for the breakdown of society in the First World War was thus a kind of Christian nihilism. So according to Gogarten, there was a need to be free from what he called a religion which has to reconcile itself to this world as it is determined by past and future, caught in the endless chain of so-called evolution, a religion which cannot announce with good conscience for its first and last message, the kingdom of God is at hand. Such a religion is itself drawn along into the contingencies from which it should be freeing us, and it will dance the insane dance of world history and so-called evolution. Such a religion has fallen from its origin, and its distance from God is indicated by the fact that it regards a sense of longing as its finest feeling, and as the feeling most expressive of its nature. So, in short, Gogarten concludes, God's holiness annihilates both world and time. History is destroyed. So in the same way, Jesus Christ is identical with the act of God and with the annihilation of the world. So the Christian religion thereby passes judgment on the whole world, and the human lot is simply to remain exactly where we find ourselves, in the annihilating, creating act of God. Everything has come to an end. So even though Gogarten went a little bit further than some of his contemporaries, but not much further than Barth, his theology and the religion it sought to explain typify much of the theological and religious questioning that followed the war in Germany. And I think all this reveals a fundamental difference from the situation in Britain, where continuity was far more important than change. Nobody was trying to get rid of history in England. There was no revolution, no desire to escape the clutches of the past. We might want to make things better, but we don't escape altogether. Post-war Britain was really simply more of the same, whereas in Germany, social collapse meant that for many, especially in the younger generation, the past had proved inadequate to meet the demands of the present, and it had to be rejected altogether. In that case, history was at an end, and the world had to be reconstructed. So the ethics of either or threatened the historic compromises of the past, which had been so important to the churches for a very long period, certainly in the years leading up to the First World War, and exemplified in such characters of Harnack and Troeltsch. So 1918 was, if you like, the year zero. Now, in contrast to their opponents, Troeltsch, Berlin and Harnack, who survived the war, continued in their search for compromises and became involved not in revolution, but in the quest for reconstruction of a stable society. So history for them still mattered. So even though Troeltsch had by this stage left the theology faculty of Heidelberg for the philosophy faculty at Berlin, he continued to see the importance of the old dispensation for the simple reason, as he put it, that the whole world is God's. The alternative, he felt, was to reduce religion to the realm of the irrelevant. It was beyond time. For this reason, those who rejected the world for God, whom he called Kierkegaard's young men, have to, as he said, draw the same conclusions as did Kierkegaard in his complete rejection of the church and cultural accommodation, which go together so closely. In Gogarten's theology of the absolute moment, there will be no pastors, no church administration, no mission, and no sermons on education and counselling. If anyone desires these results, he must necessarily attack accommodation, and the only question is how he can effect this within the narrow Protestant adherence to the Bible and the Creed. So ultimately, according to Troeltsch, Gogarten would have to do away with Christianity in all its guises, except his ascetic escape from the world. So let me try and draw these strands to a little bit of a conclusion. Obviously, there were those in Germany who adopted a very different approach and continued to see the importance of history, and who located the Christian religion within such a world that it was always going to be tainted by compromise. So Harnack moved in much the same way as had Davidson in England. So in 1918, he wrote that Harnack wrote that true pacifism rested in the ability to see a way out of the chaos of the situation, not by ignoring it, but by fully accepting its constraints. And that meant that we had to find a concrete expression for Christian ethics. And that was what was crucial for any lasting solution into the future. We have the Republic, he wrote, we must do everything to ensure that it is established on an objective foundation. In the first of the 7 maxims he laid down for the survival of that new Republic, Harnack recognized this only too clearly. No chauvinism and no rootless cosmopolitanism, but German spirit and the horizon of humanity. That was the problem. The emphasis is thus on a concrete universal expressed through the particularity of the political situation, which moves naturally towards an ethics of human rights enshrined in the popular political and national institutions. Harnack noted in his 6th maxim, democracy needs strength, and it was the duty of the Christian religion to provide this strength by upholding the new democratic settlement. So, by way of conclusion, what I hope I've highlighted through these 2 very contrasting examples is the fundamental differences in the effects of the war on religion between the victor and the defeated. In Britain, life carried on much as it had done before, and so did its religion. While there was a renewed quest for social cohesion, there was an unquestioned assumption that this was a task to be shared by church and state, working in harmony. In Germany, however, the old order had been fundamentally challenged, which meant there was a questioning of the old historical authorities in both church and state. To many, there was a need to find something quite different, which could all too easily lead to an ethics of escape or a flight into something quite anti-historical. The religion of the dialectical theologians was mirrored by a whole range of other efforts, both inside and outside the churches, at drawing religion away from its historical base. Indeed, had there been more people, especially among church leaders, whose vocation was that of human reconciliation, and who were prepared to immerse themselves fully within the real world, then things might have turned out very differently. If there had been others who followed the lead of Harnack and Troeltsch in Germany, who were prepared to dirty their hands in the ugly task of reconstruction, while fully aware of the compromises and the limitations that imposed upon them, then subsequent events in German history, and more broadly in European history, might have proved far less tragic. As Harnack wrote in the aftermath of the war, Germany is now at the end of its strength, as the devaluation of its currency reveals. It cannot go any further. What Europe now has to do, it does not have to do merely for Germany, but for itself, so that it does not perish. Now, the tragic impact of the First World War was that the vast majority of the Christian churches, especially those in Germany, failed to recognize the dangers of the retreat from history until it was far too late. And there I finish. Thank you.